Hi, I'm Michael. Welcome to Beyond the Screenplay. Today we are talking about The Silence of the Lambs, and I'm joined by the Lessons from the Screenplay team, writer Trisha Avrahan.
Good afternoon.
Writer Brian Bittner.
Good morning.
And editor Alex Calleros.
Hi.
Say good evening. Come on.
Good afternoon, Good evening, and good night. Brian, you were the one that suggested we do The Silence of the Lambs. Why did you want to talk about The Silence of the Lambs?
Oh, you're gonna make me go on this ride again, huh?
Yep.
It all started. Gather up your carpet squares and your juice boxes, kids. It's story time. It all started like way back when I was working on the Collateral video, and I was reading John Yorke's Into the Woods, and he talked about how scenes have the same structure as an act or as an entire movie. And I thought, it seems obvious, but I had never really thought about it before. And I thought, it'd be cool to do a video on the structure of a scene. Just take one scene, that's what the entire video is about, and look at the structure. And that kind of stuck in my head for months, and I had made lists of what are the most iconic scenes, Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, Silence of the Lambs, etc. Silence of the Lambs kept sort of sticking in my mind, and when we finally started talking about it, I thought, well, I don't know if we could do an entire video about one scene. That seems silly, like unless it's Inglourious Bastards where the scene is 20 minutes long.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I had the idea to take 3 scenes from Silence of the Lambs, all between Clarice and Hannibal, and talk one scene, talk about what a scene should do, and then another talk about the structure of a scene, and then talk about how scenes fit together to make kind of the bigger picture. And that's where we went for a while. And that's kind of what it was until like a week before the video went up, and Michael's like, what if we just made it all about one scene? So it was funny because it was a big process with a lot of changes and stuff, but I thought it was cool that it ended up being kind of what I had originally envisioned, which was to do a video about just one scene and sort of cover all the like major talking points about what a great scene contains in that one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is an interesting case where like the videos, as pulling back the curtain a little bit, I feel like the videos change a lot while we're working on them sometimes, and
Definitely.
This is one that changed quite a bit. And sorry for that, but I think it is interesting that part of I think what makes the videos work is when they can just be really simple and clear. And I think it's actually very hard to get something to be really simple and clear.
Right.
I think people underestimate how much work goes into that. And
Right.
so that plus the like time constraints of it was like, okay, I think to get across the most important things that's at the heart of this, I think it's best to just like trim it and keep it really focused on this one scene.
Yeah.
Which then works out that it was the original vision of it also.
And it's something I found with a couple of our first drafts is I'll just throw a bunch of ideas on the page, and then it's some that I'm like, there's no way this is gonna make it into the video, but still I'm going to include it in this draft just in case it sparks anything, or just so it's there. And then it's sort of as the fearless leader, you're the one who then takes it and says, okay, well, let's turn this into something slick. And I think that's what's nice to see the process.
And I think there's a lot of pressure this is one of the funny parts about being a part of the channel, but also focusing specifically on screenplay and some of these standards to which we hold ourselves. I think one of the most difficult things is that when there's a really amazing movie that we all love so much, there's a lot of pressure on it where we want to say exactly the right thing about it or exactly the most useful thing about it. And
we want to say everything about it.
Well, we also want to say everything about it. But in the video, we want to like save the movie for the perfect lesson. And so, there's this sense of like, we only get one shot at this movie, right? Finding the lesson in it. And that does create a lot of pressure. And so I know that probably that's something, at least I was feeling that when we were having a conversation about the video, where it was like, I don't want to just do this one scene. I mean, it's a good lesson and it's useful and everything, but there's so many more opportunities to say something about this amazing film. And sometimes simplicity is best.
We should start a podcast. We can talk about all that stuff.
What a good idea.
Well, it always strikes me how surprisingly similar the emotional creative journey seems to be for LFTS as, working on scripted material.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is scripted, I guess, in a way. It's video essays, but there's still the same emotional process of being kind of attached to early versions of a thing because that's what got you excited, but then having to realize that it's going in the wrong direction and then going a totally different direction. That one didn't work either. That got even worse somehow. And now going back to how it was in the beginning, but now better because you've learned from going in all the wrong directions.
Right.
it just, the writing process never ceases to amaze me at how it's just a lot of dead ends and a lot of like emotional anguish to arrive back at kind of what you started with, but now you've learned from the journey.
Yeah.
Seems to be the process.
Yeah. Pretty sure every video at some point, there's a moment where I'm like, this is never going to work.
Yeah.
Let's throw it out. What can we put together really quick? What if we did Mean Girls or something like, let's look into what we talked about before.
It's like a dark night of the soul where it's just,
and then you push through. Well, and what's interesting about The Silence of the Lambs and part of the challenge that I was running into when I was trying to kind of adapt what you were saying of doing each, following multiple scenes and talking about different aspects of each scene is like, I always want to try to find a nice progression in the videos where like section 2 builds on section 1, section 3 builds on section 2. And I feel like the topics we were trying to discuss didn't map out to the like flow of the scenes between Clarice and Lecter, because they're all very similar in many ways, but they're also structurally different and things, and we can kind of get into that. But that's kind of one of the other challenges is sometimes the movie doesn't cooperate and you want it to be movie. If you would just changed these two scenes, it would have made a much better video essay.
Right.
Yeah.
Like weren't you thinking of this?
The kind of dry academic lesson we're trying to teach is not like being perfectly exemplified by this scene. Like, why didn't you make it perfect for LFTS, Jonathan Demme?
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
I do think it was interesting because, I didn't write this video and you guys were working on it. I probably personally would not have chosen the third scene between them. I was like in favor of choosing the fourth scene between them because it is like sort of the most iconic and builds to like the most recognizable climax where she's telling that monologue. And obviously Jodie Foster's performance is amazing in that moment. And so you want to honor and acknowledge that scene. But I do think that it worked really well because the bones of the structure, I think, were a little more visible in that third scene. So I'm actually curious, Michael, how did you zero in on that one out of those 4 conversations?
Yeah, well, I think even in Brian's first draft, that was the scene that you were using as the structural example was the third scene.
Right, so it was already kind of picked apart.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and I did look at the other ones, and the fourth scene is, I think, the most cathartic. Like, it's the most fun scene between them because you get, like, she finishes the story of, like, the lambs and all that stuff. But because of things that you also pointed out, Brian, in your draft, like, it doesn't have the same kind of resolution. It's not the complete structure all in, within the boundaries of when they enter this location and leave this location. And that's something that I think would be really interesting to talk about too. Like, one of the things that I like in John Yorke's book, he talks about in the structure of scenes, a lot of times the inciting incident and like the resolution or climax isn't part of the actual scene,
Right?
Because it's part of a flow that's happening. And I think especially the second scene between Clarice and Dr. Lecter after she's gone to
storage locker.
The storage locker.
Found the severed head.
Right.
Yeah.
His name was Benjamin Raspail.
Exactly. I feel like that's a really good example of something that doesn't have an inciting incident because it's just like, it's off the heels of this discovery. And so we already know what the scene is about and what her goal is. And it kind of ends as a cliffhanger where it's like at the crisis point of like, I'll help you like catch him, Clarice. Like, what are you going to do? What's your choice going to be? And it cuts away to something else. And so I think that's a really good example of the kind of other kind of scene that can exist in movies that creates this momentum where you're kind of coming in late because the audience already knows what the topic is.
Right.
You're just diving into the conflict and then jumping out right at the like what's she gonna do moment to like keep people invested.
It was something I talked about in my first draft. I talked about setups and payoffs, which was that that final scene between them ends with her not getting the information because Chilton breaks in and he says, "Oh, take your case files," and then she realizes later that he had written a note that is gonna. So it's weird to talk about that scene in and of itself, where it's a good scene to talk about in the broader sense of how scenes cut together because it's setting up something that is paid off later and it itself is paying off the end of the lamb story, which was set up earlier. But I think the third scene between them it's a little bit more complete in what it does.
One thing I've realized during the writing of this video, because I was kind of hanging out at Michael's house during some of the dark night of the soul moments, was I was going a little crazy too, because I was trying to give him some feedback and like bounce ideas off of him, and I'm like, well, but like, does a scene have to have all these things? Like, maybe it's bad if a scene actually has like a beginning, middle, and end. It's like not, it's too much for just one scene, and it's part of a sequence. And what if you're cutting back and forth between different scenes that are doing different things? And it's like we want this all to be perfect so we can teach a lesson about it, but maybe this doesn't exist. So I think there's something challenging sometimes with trying to nail down these screenwriting fundamentals, because they are there.
Right.
Like you do need to have desire and conflict and obstacles and all these elements of a scene for it to have any energy and life and to work and be storytelling. But it's hard to find these perfect examples of them, because movies aren't actually that way, where they're just every scene is this exact, schematic you can just point to.
Well, and one thing especially that third scene does really well is that it actually represents a shift in the character's desires. Because once Catherine Martin is kidnapped, it is the main twist that totally sends the movie in a different direction, because there was not the urgency, there were not the stakes up until that point. Clarice essentially still believes that she's just there to like get him to do a questionnaire, more or less, because that's what she's been told by Crawford. But once Catherine Martin is kidnapped, there's those really tangible stakes, and the desires become really clarified and focused in that third scene, where it's like, we have to save her. So that gives him leverage, right, to like try to negotiate for what he wants, which is his freedom, essentially. And it gives her real motivation that we can like understand. Now, you do get the sense that the entire time in the first two scenes, Clarice kind of knows that, obviously, she knows that she's there for a reason, but her internal desire isn't clarified to herself as to what it is that she's there for. And so that third scene really does sharpen all of those motivations in a way that I think is really helpful in order to break down the structure of like, okay, so then what are the obstacles? Then what are the ways in which we're negotiating to get what we want? Because our desires are at odds, but they're still very surface level accessible to the audience at that point.
It's something I hadn't thought about before. Her desire at the beginning is she's just like in the whole first act for the most part is she's just doing her job. And then it's, oh, we need to save this person. There's someone who like could die. We need to go save them. And then by the end, it's, oh, her desire is to find inner peace. Like when you hear about the lambs and everything. So it's the protagonist that we're following, the stakes become higher each time, I think, for her, because and we as the audience go, oh, it's not just she needs to save somebody, it's she is struggling with this thing and she needs to quell, basically.
Even though we don't necessarily, you're saying like her desire is to do a job. Yes, of course it is. But we understand something else about her that's very critical from the very opening frame. Because when we're introduced to her, she's running by herself in the woods. She's at this training field. She's putting herself through these exercises. There's not a drill sergeant there that's screaming at her. There's not a lot of peer pressure or anybody else around her. She is on her own and she is pushing herself. And that is a kind of character we instantly recognize as being internally motivated and internally driven.
Sure.
And so, like, actually one of the most brilliant things about Clarice as a character is she's incredibly simple. She's internally driven toward getting the bad guy, essentially, which is a sort of a trope we see in detective characters and sort of crime solvers, generally speaking. But it is so clearly defined from the very minute that we meet Clarice. And then, we can get into it, but there's obviously pressures on her from other places, Crawford and stuff like that. We understand that Clarice is doing this because Clarice has to do this on her own. And so even before Catherine Martin gets kidnapped, those two opening scenes, while they're not as clear, they're still incredibly compelling because we already do understand that base level foundation of who Clarice is.
Well, I think it's not just that she wants to get the bad guy, it's that she's really fascinated with the psychology of criminals and psychopaths. Like, it's very clear in that first scene. She that it was a behavioral class from Crawford, and she remembers her grade from the class, and she wanted to be him one day, basically. So you can tell she's internally also just fascinated with this subject matter. And I love Jodie Foster's performance in these scenes with Hannibal Lecter, because there's that fear and there's the kind of disgust at certain moments, but there's also this fascination. And when she leans in and she's kind of onto a clue or onto understanding something, you can just see how excited she is. And that makes her a great character, because you like seeing a character love their work that much. It's always a appealing thing.
Yeah. And I will, I mean, we don't necessarily have to get a ton into the behind the scenes, although we can. But originally when they built that cell set, it was all like metal and bars and wires and everything between her. And Jonathan Demme was like, no, this not only visually does this not work, but for character reasons, this does not work. We have to let them be able to look each other in the eyes. And of course, in the case of the camera, like the direction looked us, the audience,
Directly
dead in
into
the
the-
eyes.
yeah.
Oh yeah, we can talk about this.
Horrifying, yeah.
Yeah.
But it was the production designer then that was like, plexiglass is the answer. And so they put this thick plexiglass there and then drilled those holes in it.
Well, first they put the plexiglass, and then
And then they
everyone was
couldn't hear
happy
each
except for
other,
the
yeah.
sound designer was like, we can't hear anything. Like, let's just drill some holes in it.
Yeah. But it also, it's such a brilliant move because it enables these characters to move towards each other and to see and understand each other in a way that becomes absolutely essential to the plot.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And one choice that Jonathan Demme made was with the bars. They said, well, if you don't want to shoot actors through the bars, then why don't you just put the camera in the cell with Lecter? And to his
Yeah.
credit, he said, then he's not dangerous. He's
Yep.
not dangerous if we're just hanging out with him. He's dangerous when he's on the other side of this barrier.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. Well, and yeah, just so much of the setup of Lecter helps create that danger also. Like watching it again, I was struck by how much time is spent building up
Yeah.
him and like how many people
Yeah.
warn her of like
Mhm.
don't touch the bars, don't like talk to him, blah 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 blah. And just the build up of walking down and through the whole, corridor with all the terrifying
Mhm.
people.
Yeah.
Oh
Um,
God.
that moment where Chilton shows her a picture of the nurse that apparently
And
Oh,
you don't see the
yeah.
picture.
yeah.
you don't see the picture, which is horrifying. But also, I do call BS on that a little bit because what, Chilton, are you carrying it with you at all times?
That was a weird moment of like he just has it in his back pocket
Yeah.
when he needs
It's
to.
like it's in his like breast pocket. He's like,
Yeah.
here it is. It's this little photograph of this
mean,
horrifying thing that happened.
Chilton
pretty-
seems like someone who would do that.
He's
No,
a
I mean,
pretty creepy
totally.
guy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking about the simplicity of Clarice's character, in all honesty, there's a good degree to which Hannibal Lecter is also pretty simple. He is very understandable in the sense that his desire is highly sympathetic and understandable. He wants a view of the sky. He's trapped in a cell. He seems like he's made his peace with that fact.
Mhm.
But ultimately, like, we know he wants escape. And that's a very simple, understandable, highly relatable desire.
Sure, but that's his character as it exists within the plot of the movie. That's not saying the character of Hannibal Lecter is simple, because it's really complicated.
Well, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I feel like as far as like the scenes go and
What his desire is, things
Yeah,
like that.
exactly.
yeah, and I think in the third scene, sort of like you were saying, Trisha, I feel like it does get amped up because now there's a ticking clock where
Mhm.
this woman has been kidnapped. But I feel I was also struck by how it's such a good example of how the characters' desires are in direct conflict,
Yes.
but that they also absolutely need the other one to achieve their desire. Like I
Mhm.
feel like it's such a strong example of that, where like literally they cannot, neither one can achieve what they want without the other one, and the other one does not want to give it to them.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it's just such a great setup for that drama. And also thinking about what you were just saying, Trish, of that Jodie Foster's character is so internally motivated from the
Mhm.
beginning. That kind of made me realize that's, I think, why the Lamb story is so fascinating.
Mm.
It's because you do want to know like what's in there, like why is she so driven, like what is her backstory. And I think that's kind of what also makes you kind of empathetic toward Lecter in some moments, that he's able to like see that and is also curious about it in the way that I feel like the audience is.
Well, it's therapy. I mean,
Right.
it's,
True.
how
He
could
was a therapist.
How could you resist if you have a serial killer that is a therapist? How could you possibly resist putting an FBI agent on the couch across from him and forcing her to have a therapy session with Hannibal Lecter over the course of these 4 conversations? But ultimately, that's what it is.
It's
I
kind of
thought it was weird when they hug at the end and he says, it's not your fault. Like, I didn't buy that.
Bit of a stretch.
I mean, I was going to say, it's kind of the promise of the premise. You have to do that. If
Exactly.
the serial killer is going to be a psychologist, you have to. And I was thinking watching this movie, like, wow, how many films send Silence of the Lambs, put the bad guy in a box and have him try to be this like Hannibal Lecter-ish, like charming and smart, but diabolical, and like having this. But this is like the original one, and it's so good. I just watching it again. I remember when I saw it back when I was in high school, and I was like, this one Best Picture, and like it's a horror thriller. Like what? This isn't like an Academy Award movie. But watching it again, it's like, no, this was a director that took a genre movie, and I think the acting and the cinematography and the editing, everything about it just elevates it to more than just a simple, procedural genre, crime genre.
The Silence of the Lambs is of course based on a book, and as we'll soon go on to talk about, there are some intriguing differences between the book and the film. Among other things, in the book, the story is told from a more omniscient point of view, whereas in the film, the focus is on Clarice as the protagonist. The book also dives more into each of the characters, giving the reader more details about the backstories of all the main players. If you're interested in checking out the book, I recommend listening to the audiobook on Audible. With Audible, you get access to an unbeatable selection of audiobooks, including bestsellers, motivation, mysteries, thrillers, like The Silence of the Lambs and the other Hannibal Lecter stories, memoirs, and more. Audible members can choose 3 titles every month, 1 audiobook and 2 Audible originals you can't hear anywhere else. And you can listen on any device, anytime, anywhere. And you can start a 30-day trial today and get your first audiobook for free by going to audible.com/screenplay or by texting screenplay to 500-500. Once again, head to audible.com/screenplay or text screenplay to 500-500 to start a 30-day trial and to let them know you came from our show. Thanks to Audible for sponsoring this episode of Beyond the Screenplay.
And the studio really had no faith in it. They eventually pushed it back. When Dances with Wolves, Orion was like, oh, we got Dances with Wolves. Forget about this other like weird movie. They pushed it to February instead of Oscar season. So it came out on Valentine's Day, 1991.
Well, Jonathan Demme thought it would be a great date movie.
Right. And
true story.
Yeah.
Wow.
But then just the word of mouth was so strong on it and everything that it's one of the only 3 movies ever to win the big 5 Oscars. And but that's pretty impressive. They put it out nowhere close to Oscar season, and it had that much staying power until the end of the year that people were still thinking about it. And
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many, which first of all, I'm so thankful for that, because if it had to go up against Dances with Wolves at the Oscars, it would have gone really differently probably. And also keep in mind, so then by pushing it into 1991, although it was released very early in the year, it ended up being like in the same time frame as like Thelma and Louise and some other movies. Like, so Jodie Foster was actually up against both Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis in the Best Actress category. Both of them were nominated for Thelma and Louise.
Wow.
And Jodie Foster was nominated with them, and obviously a couple other women. But like, what an amazing year for female roles. These amazing, just so well realized, courageous, highly relatable, highly intelligent women. But I'm really glad. Like, it turned out to be a smart move on Orion's part that we all ended up sort of reaping the benefit of, because it allowed the film to be judged on its own merits, instead of pitting it unnecessarily against things. Obviously, we just came out of Oscar season, so that's kind of raw,
on our minds.
I think, for all of us right now.
Very interesting Oscar season.
Oh, it really was, wasn't it, guys?
Oh boy.
We don't have to talk about that in any way.
Well, it kind of reminds me also of Seven when I was watching it, of sort of like you were saying, Alex, like a genre movie that somehow became like a masterpiece. And just I was also struck by how many movies have copied it, like how this created like a new, not cliche, but like an archetypal situation of like you need the bad person to achieve the goal. And and I was just thinking a lot about Seven, and just there's an interesting era of the 90s that I feel like maybe I wasn't even like conscious of until recently, where there were these like new ground was being like treaded that I don't think I was really aware of at the time. But like,
well, we were all young.
Right. Well, yeah, sure. I never would have been allowed to see this as a child.
No. Well, there were sort of 2. 90s were lots of thrillers, like late
Mhm.
80s, second half of the 80s, especially early half of the 90s. There was this incredible rise in thrillers. So you have sort of like psychological thrillers, which I think Silence of the Lambs is a pretty amazing example of. And then you have the erotic thrillers, which were also being made, like Fatal Attraction.
And where I love What Lies Beneath.
Yeah,
Michelle
What Lies-
Oh my
Pfeiffer.
God.
also a really good one.
Love
Harrison
that
Ford.
movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was the year after this that they made
Irrationally.
Kim Basinger. Help me.
Basic
Basic Instincts.
Instinct,
Thank
yeah.
you. Yeah. So this was right in the heyday of all
Sharon
of those
Stone.
thrillers.
Yeah. Kim
Sharon
Basinger
Stone,
is
which
Believe us, Sharon
L-
Stone.
LA Confidential.
I do believe you. Okay, which erotic thriller am I thinking of with Kim Basinger?
I don't know.
Malice.
Look, we'll ask Google. It'll be
Oh,
fine.
Wayne's World too.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
she was Garth's
thank you.
girlfriend.
correct.
Yeah.
You're right. Okay. So, but yeah, these thrillers that were going on in the 90s, and I think that one of the things that Silence of the Lambs does incredibly well is focus on the thriller aspect rather than any of the the erotic aspect, which obviously it doesn't even touch on at all, or the horror aspect. There are these sort of
I mean, I think there's a lot of horror in Silence of the Lambs
I feel like
for a
it's
thriller.
I feel like
Sure.
there are like really intense moments of it.
Yeah.
There's not a lot, but they're very powerful.
Right. I feel like the thing that stayed with me about that film when I first saw it was just, these like sharp moments of just what they just showed me that they just did that. Oh
Mm.
my God. And that's what kind of like gets burned into your brain the first time. And so you kind of, that's one thing that seeing it as a younger person did almost bypass the masterpiece qualities of it, because I was like, wow, I was very disturbed by this particular moment or this particular scene.
Mhm.
And I kind of forgot how much of a masterpiece the rest of it is. And so it was really fun to revisit it as
Well, it doesn't depend in
Yeah.
any way on jump scares.
right.
The most horrifying moments in it are not moments where a thing jumps out of somewhere. And I think the only moment that's a little bit like that is when you see sort of the head that's in that jar
Mhm.
where she
Right.
like pulls it down. But you do know there's something bad in there already.
Right. It's not really a
Right.
So
jump.
it's not
Yeah.
really trying to come out of the corner and like surprise you.
And I feel like some of the makeup kind of has aged a little bit. Like
Oh,
I'm not that
definitely.
freaked, but I was like, oh, I don't think I'm supposed to be able to see it this clearly on like 4K TV.
4K,
and-
yeah.
You know, Buffalo Bill's makeup is not supposed to be great, right?
I expect better.
Which, by the way, I have a friend who has a friend who was babysat by Ted Levine.
No.
Oh,
No.
And how
What?
crazy is it that like that's just an actor, but like the fact that he played this character where all, like everyone just had the same reaction, like
Right.
like he's gonna show up and be
Horror.
like, it brushes its teeth by 9 a.m. or it gets the hose again. Like no, like that's not.
Well, it's so interesting because obviously he did an amazing job in this part. He had a really hard time finding work after this though, because
Right.
even though he's fantastic in this role, it's an incredibly challenging role. And some of the most like creepy things about it were things that he invented himself for the
Mhm.
role. Even so, people were so upset by it that they then like kind of didn't want to cast him. It's this sort of stigma now that's now associated with it.
It is weird that like as an actor you can be too good and just be
Right.
like,
right.
oh, wow, you were so good at that I will never think of you as anything
Right.
but that ever again.
Right. Well, and just thinking about Buffalo Bill's character for a minute, do we want to touch on like the
Sure.
controversy?
Go ahead.
I mean,
Absolutely.
when I first saw it, I didn't put the dots together that there was any kind of like anti-gay, anti-trans thing
Mhm.
going on, because it just so clearly, and they even say in
They
the
do.
movie, he's not a real transsexual. They were saying transsexual back then. He's not a
Mhm.
real transsexual. It's something else. It's something
Right.
he just hates himself so much he wants to become anything else besides what he is.
Mhm.
But it was interesting because I remember hearing about that controversy after watching it, and I think if you hadn't really like watched the movie closely and just kind of heard about it,
Mhm.
it would be very potentially damaging, because it's like
Yeah.
there's almost no trans characters in movies, and then the one we get like in the 90s
Yeah.
is
Right.
like the worst,
Horrifying
creepiest,
serial
most
killer.
horrifying person ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like people said he almost made Philadelphia as like a makeup with like the gay
Mhm.
community.
Like, sorry about that.
But it's interesting because it's that question of, and I think there's been some other movies like that. Like there's that movie Orphan a few years ago.
No, sorry.
Do you see it? It was like whatever. It was like kind of a B movie. It was fun. But if you didn't see it, you might think it's like saying that Russian kids are all creepy and you shouldn't adopt, and adoption is like kind of dangerous because you might get a screwed up kid. but like the actual twist in the movie is like, do you want me to, should I spoil it here?
Spoilers, everybody. Go ahead, Alex.
If you really want to see
Orphan
Orphan
and
let's
haven't
stop
yet,
pause
listening
now.
now.
The twist is that it's not actually a child. It's like somebody with like a genetic thing that makes them like look like a child. It's like actually like an older woman, and she's like, using the adoption system to like kill people.
Michael's face is
Creepy.
like,
It's like a really weird movie. Yeah. But so if you saw the movie, you'd know like it's not actually about an actual child from Russia being something you shouldn't adopt. It's actually about this twist.
right.
So I feel like there's controversies that happen around movies sometimes where you haven't actually seen the movie. You just know a thing happens in it, or it's about this subject matter. And then there's like a protest around that. But it's like, maybe you should watch it first. I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Jonathan Demme was very clear, and so was Ted Talley about this at the time, even that exactly what you were saying. Buffalo Bill is not gay. He's not trans. He just hates himself, ultimately. And he was also, and Jonathan Demme, obviously was a masterful director and has done so much for, like, was an activist as well, did so much for all kinds of causes, and then became known as sort of an issues director because of this, because of Philadelphia and a number of other films and things that he worked on. But he absolutely wanted to emphasize more, or like dive more into the Buffalo Bill character and paint a more full and fair picture of this individual who was, it is mentioned, deep, systematically abused as a child, in that cycle of abuse kind of way that we now understand about those that are criminals and people who harm others and stuff like that. He wanted to get into more of that because he wanted to treat that character more fairly, and it just ended up not being a thing that the movie could do because it was so focused on Clarice and her story, which is kind of a shame. And I do understand that why that backlash happened at the time. I mean, there was also controversy around Jodie Foster because there were rumors about her sexuality, which now we all know that she's gay and she's like very out about it now. But at the time, that was like, ooh, Jodie Foster, is she gay? Is she dating a woman? Who knows? And people it was 1991. No one had the right language to really have a conversation about that wasn't like universally scared or condemning.
Was the controversy about her being gay and being in this movie, or just her being gay potentially at all? That was the controversy, was just she might be gay.
I think it was about the sexuality of the character. Like, are they asking her to play straight and she's gay? Is she gay already? It's unclear. I don't think.
It's like she's playing a human being who is trying to catch a killer.
She's trying to catch a serial killer.
It sounds like it was, early 90s. That's a very interesting time in the gay community. It's like the AIDS crisis is still going on.
Absolutely.
It's like a very touchy time. Yeah. So I think if you're going to do a movie that does touch on those issues, it's probably going to touch a nerve. Yeah.
Exactly. And in Philadelphia, you could see it as a response to some of that. But at the same time, Jonathan Demme was absolutely friends with a lawyer who was HIV positive and was dealing with those issues in the early 90s. And so he has very publicly said, like, no, it was about my friend. I wanted to work on Philadelphia because it was a friend of mine that was experiencing something similar to this. And so, we obviously are reading this with an incredible amount of hindsight. But, I mean, I don't think the movie has aged in such a way that it's not watchable anymore. Like some of our older movies are, where now the progress that we as a society have made overshadows anything the movie was or is. I don't think that has happened to Silence of the Lambs at all.
Right. And I was actually, because I hadn't seen it since I was young enough to not get the controversy. Watching it again, I was kind of bracing myself for like, oh shoot, am I going to feel awkward about some of this? But I was like, no, they actually kind of directly address it. Jodie Foster says there's no connection between being transsexual and having violent actions.
Yeah, she does.
So they do address it directly in the text of the movie. So I was like, okay, this is actually, I'm not feeling uncomfortable about this. This feels like it's aged okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of interesting stuff that had to be changed from the book, and because the book focuses on these characters, it goes a lot into Buffalo Bill and what his childhood was like and why he is the way he is, and et cetera, et cetera. It's sort of obsessed with his mother, and like that's kind of why he is trying on these personalities.
It's very Norman
and everything.
Bates.
Right. And then you have Jack Crawford, his wife is dying, and he's taking care of her, all this stuff, some of which was in the script and then didn't end up making the movie. But the interesting thing is there was a lot of red tape. Like the first scene between Clarice and Hannibal when he says, "Show me your credentials." In the book, it's like she's like, "I already showed my credentials at the door," and he's like, "Yeah, but I want to see him." And she's like, "Barney, can you come over here?" And Barney's like, "Okay, I'll give you the credentials, but no funny business." It's like, just, and it's a book. It's not apples to apples, but still, it's like it's like a page of red tape just before they can start having a conversation. And then when you get to the script, obviously he cut a bunch of that out. But then a lot of it is still there. There's a great scene that's actually was shot and it's on the deleted scenes between Crawford goes to Johns Hopkins to get information, and it's a cool scene because he kind of is like threatening the guy and whatever, and then like finally the guy gives in and gives the information. In the movie, Crawford says, "Oh, Johns Hopkins came through," and it's like, yeah, that's really all the information you need. You don't need. It's a good scene, but it's not a scene that really furthers the plot that we're talking about. And it got to the point where Ted Talley was actually concerned that they were cutting so much out. He said, well, I think the audience is going to be confused. And Jonathan Demme said, well, it's better to confuse them for 5 minutes than to bore them for 5 seconds.
Yes.
So I was like that, talking about respecting the audience and that kind of thing.
I like that.
Even the scene that we talk about in the video, the quid pro, I'm not going to be able to say it.
Squid.
You can do it. I believe in you.
Just think of Jody.
Quid pro quo.
Yeah.
Did it. Great. Even that scene changed from the script. And that was during the Dark Night of the Soul writing it, that was one of the like speed bumps I hit that was like, well, it's different in the movie than in the script. And is it fair to talk about it in the movie? Blah, blah. And I wanted to address it, but we didn't. But now I can. Where
Michael still hasn't quite recovered, I think, from making this video.
I was really sick when I was working on this. But it is interesting in the script version of the scene. It does take a lot longer to get started and kind of get to like the meat of the scene, and it begins with less of a clear inciting incident, where it's just kind of assumed, that Clarice has come and kind of let him know that there's an offer. So he's like kind of giving information at the beginning, but like then later is like, okay, but no, I want to hear your actual offer. And then she gives him the offer, and then he's like, okay, well, quid pro quo, we're going to do this. Still didn't say it right.
No, you got it that time.
Well, so it was interesting. Yeah. Just comparing those two and to see in the editing of the final version, how they changed the structure to really emphasize and amplify the sort of more traditional structure. So it does begin with like a very clear inciting incident, and then everything that happens is much more motivated, I feel like, in the final version than it was in the original script.
Right.
Editing is the final draft.
That's right. I can't tell which I find more disturbing about Hannibal Lecter, all the terrible murders that he committed or that weird play on words he does with turns.
It's so insane.
She's like, turns
really
and that's
bothers me.
Yeah. It's like, hey, remember a second ago when you said turns, like the bird, like with an E?
It's gonna
so
be
like
turns.
if you and I want to do this thing, like it'll be turn, like we'll take turn, like with a U. Get it? Because you remember what you said.
It is one of the
bird?
weirdest lines in the movie. Like I did kind of a double take when editing it. Like, he just did that. Okay.
I looked it up in the book, and it's just like she says turns roost there, and he says turns like with the E, and then he kind of launches into, well, look, I have to get something out of this. So you can see like in his mind, he's thinking that little play on words, but he doesn't come out and say it because I don't know, it doesn't feel like a very Hannibal Lecter thing.
It does feel a little goofy.
Yeah.
That's like, oh, you just used a pun to transition.
Right.
Yeah.
Not so much.
But I feel like that's also where, give it to Anthony Hopkins and it will work.
Yeah.
Right.
And it'll
I
be
also
fine.
I didn't really question it the first time I saw the movie. I just, upon reading the script and seeing the words, I was like, whoa. What?
Yeah, same.
But yeah, if Anthony Hopkins is saying it, you're like, okay.
Yeah.
So backing up a little bit, which I'm sure you've done a ton of reading about this also, Brian. So originally Gene Hackman was the person that was on board to direct this movie.
And possibly play Hannibal.
Which we can all just like breathe a sigh of relief that it
that
didn't
would've
go
been
down
weird.
that way. No offense to Gene Hackman. He's amazing. So he really was going to direct the movie, and he was probably either going to play Hannibal or Crawford, which I actually think he would have been a pretty good Crawford.
Sure.
Yeah.
And he ended up not doing that. But then when he left the project, so Ted Talley was already writing. Ted Talley had met with Gene Hackman. He'd actually like gone to Gene Hackman's ranch in Arizona and spent like days there trying to sell himself as the screenwriter for this movie. And finally got the gig, went away and was writing it. And then months later, in the middle of the night, gets a phone call and is like, yeah, Gene bounced. And so Ted Talley was like, what the heck? Am I still on this project? What's happening with it? I don't understand.
And they're like, just keep writing.
His agent was like, just keep writing. We'll sort it out. And then when Jonathan Demme came on board, he took Ted out to lunch and he basically was like, listen, I trust you completely. I love this story. I've seen some of what you've done already. You are the only person who's going to work on this. You're going to finish it. We're going to shoot what you write. That's that. Which honestly is an amazing dream for a screenwriter.
Pretty crazy, yeah.
It's so nuts. And that is pretty much exactly what happened. And so, Jonathan Demme, they say that like 85% of what is in the movie was in Ted Tally's first draft, pretty much.
Well, I remember reading that it was pretty rushed at that point. Like Jonathan Demme came out and then suddenly it was like, go, go, go.
Right.
And so Ted Tally was saying in an interview like this, we didn't really have that much time to like second guess it or do a bunch of different drafts. It was just like, all right, let's go. Which is pretty impressive.
Yeah. What amazing faith from the director, though, that just what is on the page is capturing what needs to be done with the story. And it really was Ted Tally that singled out Clarice as being the main character out of the book. Because the book is more omniscient, where it's like you're jumping around. You're seeing Buffalo Bill. You're seeing all this different stuff. And then Clarice is among the many characters that are a part of this thing. And it was Ted Tally that was like, no, this is Clarice. Like, that's what we need. And actually, Jodie Foster zeroed in on that as well from the minute that she read the book. When she read the book, she was like, I have to play Clarice. Clarice is the main character. It's Clarice's story. And so she was lobbying for the part. She actually tried to buy the rights to the book herself.
Mm-hmm.
And wasn't Jonathan Demme pretty skeptical of her? Like he didn't believe that she could do it or she wasn't right for it. Yeah, there's a whole process. Well, he wanted
to work with Michelle Pfeiffer.
Yes,
because he had just finished working with her. And he was, Michael's face is like, oh no.
Also,
I love Michelle Pfeiffer.
Sure.
Also, Jonathan Demme had just been doing like screwball comedies and stuff. So it was like we're gonna screwball comedy, and he just worked with Michelle Pfeiffer, and like, everyone's like, "What? This is like a not that kind of movie." And then he didn't make that kind of movie.
Yeah. So Jodie Foster was lobbying hard for the part. She actually called Ted Tally. She found his number. She'd never met him before. She heard he was working on it. Found his number, called him up, and was like, "Are you going to write a part for me?" And he was like, "I think I am right now." And so then it actually ended up being a trade. Again, this is all according to what I've read. I was not there. I was 5. But it ended up being a trade, essentially. The studio wanted Hopkins, I think it was, or Demme wanted Hopkins.
Right, because Demme had seen him in...
Tally wanted Foster. And they were like, all right, you can get what you want if I get what I want. And they just made that piece with it.
It worked out.
And the rest was history.
It worked out.
Yes.
Yeah.
My God.
So incredible.
And Demme had seen Hopkins in The Elephant Man,
That's right.
where he plays this kind of quiet, compassionate doctor. And Hopkins was like, really? That's what made you think of for this part? And to Hopkins' credit, he was like, yeah, I wanted to do everything against what you're expecting when you first meet him. And that's sort of where the stillness of Lecter comes in.
And can we just talk about the Demme like direct into camera thing?
Yeah.
Because some movies, I think in Philadelphia, there were some moments when I first saw it. Once again, I should rewatch it as an adult. But when I saw that also as a teenager, it did take me out of the movie sometimes where it just felt almost too forced, where there's like a tracking shot with somebody just staring into the camera. It's like, that's too much. But in this movie, talk about a form meeting function or whatever term that should be there. Basically like the content calling for that direct to camera and just cutting to Anthony Hopkins looking with those eyes, cutting to Jodie Foster and her vulnerability. Like, it's so amazing.
I mean, I'm sure we were all too young for it, but I can't imagine seeing this on the big screen. Can you imagine seeing Anthony Hopkins' eyes staring right at you 50 feet across? It's just, what a brave choice. I mean, and obviously this movie is full of incredibly inspired and brave choices from Jonathan Demme. One of the things I love most is that Jodie Foster is this incredibly petite woman, and he doesn't bother to stand her on an apple box.
Oh no!
Or like
lots of shots of her surrounded by like hulking dudes who are all wearing the same uniform, and she's wearing like something different. And
it really emphasizes her otherness and her personal stakes. I was thinking about this. I think that in a lot of action thriller movies, the hero isn't allowed to show fear. So if you imagine like some of our big like action movies, I was thinking about Die Hard, your favorite movie, Michael. And I was just thinking about John McClane sort of as like an archetypal action hero and how he's never really scared. Like he's angry, he's annoyed, he's in pain, he's possibly anxious or worried, but that's sort of gut level I am scared for my life. I'm trembling in fear. We don't really ever see that from our archetypal action heroes, or we rarely see that from our archetypal action heroes. And one thing I love about Jonathan Demme's direction here and Foster's performance is that Clarice is terrified.
Well, especially the finale.
Oh my gosh.
I love her performance in the finale.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like when she's like yelling to Catherine Martin that's like,
Right.
help is on the way. It's
Right.
like, it's so not true. And you can so tell she
Yes.
doesn't believe. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When there's so much nuance in it also where like,
Yeah.
there's moments where she's like, it'll be okay. Like, I'm here to help. Everything's fine. And then moments later, it's like, shut up. Like, I'm trying to, like, be quiet. She, like, I just love that exchange feels so real. And I feel like
Yes.
that makes
Yeah.
it feel even more stressful.
Well, that's part of what like elevates this movie. You know, like in a
Yes.
normal crime thriller genre movie, that exchange would not have been that real, but it
Mhm.
was so
Right.
real, and I
Yeah.
just love it. Yeah.
Well, and the fact that she is just wrestling her way through her fear at every moment. And you can see that on her face. She's there alone. She doesn't have any backup. There is absolutely no one there to save the day except for her. And not just in the climax. She's so alone from the very first moment
The
that
whole
we
movie.
meet
I
her.
mean,
Yeah.
the first
She's
scene
so
with
alone.
Lecter is a pretty horrific experience,
Mhm.
start to finish
Absolutely.
for her.
Yeah,
One of the things that stuck in
course.
my mind when I first saw it.
Utter
was
horror.
the end of
yes.
that scene.
The worst.
When Miggs does his thing.
Yeah.
That's what every frame of painting calls it.
Miggs.
It's
Yeah.
something like- that's a good. And I feel like also if people haven't seen the Every Frame of Painting video about Silence of the
Mhm.
Lambs,
Yeah.
it's just sort of conceived or somewhat intended to be a companion piece to that, where they go through the first scene between Lecter and Clarice and talk about the dynamics of the scene, but also
Editing and shot composition.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. Like you were saying, Alex, how it's like, what moments are they looking directly into the camera? What moments do they
Mhm.
cut away? And like, how
Mhm.
does that
Mhm.
change the power
So
dynamics
intentional.
and stuff?
It's
Yeah.
everything's done with such intention, which I always appreciate.
Yeah.
Barry Jenkins did the straight to camera with both Moonlight and Beale Street.
Yeah.
And I think didn't Demi say like I officially anoint him as the first person to have done this in my style
Oh.
since me. Yeah,
Mm.
I think there was an IndieWire article where Jonathan Demme was like, I officially like approve of Barry Jenkins' direct-to-camera style.
Wow.
It's the first one I've seen since myself that I think is like doing what I did. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was talking about it the Q&A I went to. I don't know what the I is. Question and information. And he was saying that it's really effective from a directorial standpoint because the audience is having the actor speak directly to them, and it really arrests you. But he said that the actress, who I think this was her first movie,
Right.
in Beale Street, she was saying, "Do you know how hard it is to give your energy to nothing? Like,
Wow.
like instead of being able to do a scene with somebody, I have to do this entire scene to this camera,
big
and it's
piece
really
of glass.
challenging." Yeah.
So all those
Yeah.
amazing scenes,
uh-huh.
Mhm.
all
Right.
those- they're looking at a giant lens in their face.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's what struck me also, is that it's not just that it's to camera, but it does feel like they're performing the scene with the
you.
camera, with you. And
Right.
and I feel like that, that's hard.
On
Yeah.
that note, there was in the script, there's a flashback when Clarice gives her Lambs monologue.
Mhm.
Oh,
First
right.
cut
Yeah.
back to like the young actress, and she is doing the Lambs thing, and
The lambs thing.
Right.
she's
You
doing
like see
that
her
whole-
like
right.
running and
And,
it's a flashback.
when they shot the scene between Lecter and Clarice, Jonathan Demme showed Ted. He called Ted Talley and said, "You have to come look at these dailies." So Ted Talley
Mhm.
comes and he shows him the performance, and Ted Talley's like, "Her performance is incredible." And he says, "Yeah, if I put flashback over this, I'm going to get kicked out of the DGA."
Right. Well, that was one of the moments reading the script that I was horrified when that happened. I was like,
Mhm.
oh my God, I can't imagine cutting away, seeing
Right.
like how much less effective it would be. Because I feel like her performance is just so amazing. And just when you see her, like, even just like sometimes she's looking this way when she's thinking one thing, but like then her eyes go this way, and you feel like she's really reliving these moments.
Right.
And it's like, Jodie Foster, it's like,
Yeah.
stop. You're too good.
Well, and sort of returning to one of the things that I can't stop thinking about in terms of this movie, it's the power of showing somebody who is genuinely scared and yet has the internal resolve to keep going through that.
Right.
I work with kids a lot. I volunteer, and I love the book Coraline by Neil Gaiman. And there's moments in Coraline is in some ways a character that reminds me of Clarice Starling. But she's really by herself in a lot of that book, and it's horrifying. She has to face these like series of tests and challenges, and she is alone. And so there's a moment where she comes through this absolutely scary. That book is, by the way, one of the scariest children's books I could ever imagine, because it's written at about a 4th grade reading level. And it's written, the prose itself is really quite simplistic, and like the lexicon and the reading level is very accessible to younger kids. But even with very spare prose, Gaiman is able to convey so much like terror.
Well, I love the movie for that reason too, because it's like one of my favorite quote unquote kids movies, because it's legitimately disturbing.
Absolutely. But there's a moment that Coraline comes through this absolutely horrifying situation, and she has a brief moment where she's able to stop and rest, and then she has to go into another terrifying situation, which actually is in a basement. And she has to go down into a cellar. She knows that whatever is going to be down there is going to be terrifying and somehow worse than what she's just come through. She knows that. And so she gives herself a hug, and she tells herself that she is brave, even though she doesn't feel brave. She tells herself that she is brave, and she goes down into the basement. And I just couldn't get over that image of somebody who is genuinely scared. And it conveys that it's so much more earned, the climax of this movie, that Clarice's triumph has so much greater power, because we know how scared she was to do this, and yet she had no other choice but to do this. It's the entire journey for her, is to master that fear so she can save somebody else. It's incredible.
Yeah. And I feel like it also, in the end, it feels like she just got really lucky. Like, she could have died multiple times. Like, you see from his perspective, like, he's there, like, toying with her almost.
Touching her hair, just hanging out.
Oh.
Yeah. And I feel like it's the emotionality behind it that I feel like kind of makes up for it. Not makes up for it, but, like, you know, it's almost like a Deus Ex Machina kind of feeling of an ending, where it's like, you know, he didn't have to like, he could have killed her if he wanted to, but like, you're still just so relieved and happy that she was able to, you know, achieve this thing, that it kind of, the mechanics of how it all plays out, I feel like is overridden by just the emotional relief of like, that could have gone really bad. I'm glad it didn't, though, because of how it, you know, the result that happened.
And Brooke Smith, the actress who plays Catherine Martin, that's her name, right?
Yeah,
Brooke Smith.
Brooke something.
Yeah. It was one of her very first roles ever. And Jonathan Demme cast her on purpose as someone who didn't have a ton of experience, because he was trying to terrify her, which, again, that character, I don't know how she's written in the book, but that character, again, is so relatable, because she does end up becoming victimized and could very easily lose her life, and doesn't stop fighting. Like, the fact that she is so scrappy and she's willing to like
get this dog
and she's constantly screaming profanity at Buffalo Bill. It's amazing. But it is also just like, imagine if that character were passive. Imagine if that character were resolved to die. There would be no tension. There would be no rooting for her. There'd be no hope. So much is lost by not having this struggle, or would be lost by not having this struggle. It makes the climax of that movie so effective. And Jonathan Demme was worried about that. He was like, all of this, and we're just gonna like go in a basement? Like, it's not going to be of an explosion or a shootout or whatever.
Right.
It's not a big Hollywood thing.
Another thing I remember from seeing it the first time was it did feel kind of like a sudden ending. Like, there's the night vision, and then she shoots him, and then it's over, and it's like, oh, that's it. Okay, that was it. So I can see why he was nervous about that. But watching it again, a lot of this has been just me reflecting on my teenage brain and my 30-something brain. But 30-something brain appreciates the emotional character arc so much that, like you were saying, Michael, it really doesn't matter that it's not a big flashbang. Hannibal Lecter shows up also, and like everything ties together perfectly. It wasn't about that. It was about Jodie Foster and her character's journey, and that is what feels so satisfying with her having to do the hardest, scariest thing ever at the end.
Yeah, Absolutely. It's almost more like that she goes into the basement.
Yes,
is like the important
That's
part.
the point.
And then like whatever happens after that,
she happens to survive.
Incidental. Right. Yeah, exactly.
I thought about that moment so much, where it was like, did she have to go down there? And the obvious answer is yes, because like you can hope, or assume maybe even that he's going to take an opportunity to make a run for it. Like maybe he'll go out a basement window and try to get away, but he's probably going to kill Catherine Martin before he does. And so there's absolutely no way for her arc for her not to go into that basement because she's there to save the lambs. And so she has to save Catherine Martin. She can hear her screaming, like, I don't think from the top of the stairs, but very quickly after she gets down there. So yes, she absolutely does. No matter, like, she can't wait for backup. She can't just leave and call, like, the phone is probably there right in the kitchen. She probably could call Crawford right there or the local cops or whatever. But that isn't an option because if it goes that way, Catherine Martin dies and then she doesn't save the lambs. And that's so well set up and that's so well earned that when she makes the incredibly, insanely difficult decision that I'm sure I would never have the courage to personally do to go into that basement, we buy it.
Yeah, it is always stressful I feel like anytime I feel like I want to have like I want to talk to like a police strategist or something to know like what is the protocol? Because I feel like if you're chasing someone and you're entering a maze where they know everything and you know nothing, how could you possibly expect that to go well?
Right.
Like, is that just a movie thing or is there actual some logic to it?
I know, I'm sure that there is. And I'm sure it's like, again, if there isn't an innocent life on the line, I'm sure you just like, okay, we're going to set up a perimeter, whatever, try to get it.
Or at least like
way.
let somebody else know where you are.
Right, of
But
course. Well,
that's
and
not the point of the story.
I do want to say one quick thing. The intercutting between
the fake out.
Yeah,
it's a
the
good fake out. Yeah.
It's obviously one of the most iconic things about this movie. And I was like, could this possibly be written into the script in quite the same way? And the truth is, yeah. Ted Talley wrote it just like that, where the beats are exactly lined up with like and then the buzzer goes off downstairs, and then you can see the flower delivery man, like FBI guy ringing the doorbell. And it is an incredibly well cut, amazingly suspenseful fake out that works super well and was on the page. One encouraging lesson for me, which I'm sure we're about to get into lessons, but one encouraging lesson for me was just that sometimes write exactly the movie that you see. And sometimes you'll get lucky and Jonathan Demme will make your movie and
Right.
shoot it just like you wrote it, pretty much. Aside from some flashbacks you didn't need anyway. Maybe.
But like maybe don't count on that
No,
happening.
no, you did. Of course not.
Yeah. Why don't we go ahead and go around and talk about, what are the lessons that we will be taking away from The Silence of the Lambs? Brian, would you like to go first?
Sure. It sounds silly, but it genuinely I learned a lot about what good scenes have. One of the quotes that we originally wanted to put in the video was by Linda Seger from her book, Making a Good Script Great, where she talks about a script should advance the story and build character, which are two things we talk about, and also build an image and explore a theme. And she basically, what I like about that quote was she says, a great scene does all of these. A good scene does some of them. And I think that's nice because it's a nice tentpole or a nice something to shoot for, but it also kind of leaves you a little to say, like, look, not every scene has to be everything. Not every scene has to have a 3-act structure. Not every scene has to do this. But if you want to have your great scene in your movie, like maybe focus on that, doing as much as possible, and then your other scenes can sort of pick and choose which things you want from there. And it's also interesting how you realize that you were doing some of this stuff all along. Be like, oh, I didn't realize that I had put obstacle in my scenes. Or like something you didn't know you were supposed to do, in quotes, but that you had done anyway because you had seen things and you know what a good scene is. In Aaron Sorkin's masterclass, he talks about the movie Fargo, and he's talking about scenes that drive the story and things. And he says there's one scene in Fargo where Frances McDormand meets up with this old like high school friend, and he's kind of in love with her.
Yeah.
Oh, you're such a super lady, that whole scene. He's like, it has nothing to do with anything, but it's the Coen brothers, and it's an amazing scene. And it was just one of those funny things of like, yeah, sometimes you can completely break the rules and say, let's put this scene in this movie that has nothing to do with anything, but then obviously like looking at the shoulds and the what you should be doing.
I could debate about that.
Yeah.
I love that scene.
It's a
and
character
I think
moment.
It's a
I mean,
thing.
for
Sure.
her.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like, the rules are not so much rules as I feel like that they're tools to like help bring things to consciousness. You can be deliberate about what you're doing
Yeah.
and not blindly just follow what McKee says.
Right.
No.
Ideally. Alex?
I kind of got into my premeditated takeaway earlier, just talking about how I think the lesson I took away was, wow, you can be kind of given what could be a very procedural crime thriller movie. You could do it and execute in a very kind of just standard way, and it'd probably be fine and entertaining. But just the fact that you can take material like this that you wouldn't think would be the 5 big Oscar winner, and just make so many good choices at every step of the screenwriting, of the cinematography, the actors you cast, the way it's cut, everything about it is done so masterfully. And he bothered to do that in what could have been a more pulpy,
absolutely
thriller kind of material. So it was a good lesson for me of like, wow, never discount the genre you're working in. You can make it the Oscar version of that genre, and like, why not?
Yeah.
A movie like that in more recent years that I had that feeling from was Prisoners, the Denis Villeneuve.
Yeah.
I mean, it was definitely a less perfect movie than Silence of the Lambs in a lot of ways, but just the Roger Deakins cinematography and the music by Johan Johansson, and like just it had those extra elements of like, oh, I went to this movie just thinking it was going to be just a typical like, oh, kids are kidnapped, kind of thriller movie, and it was so much more than that. And it was just what a wonderful surprise to go to a theater not expecting that and to get it. I want that to happen more. So
yeah. Trisha?
I have a couple really fast things I'm going to try to go through quickly, which I didn't get to earlier. Patricia Highsmith, who is one of my favorite writers of all time. She's a novelist, but she wrote Strangers on a Train, upon which the Hitchcock movie is based. And she also wrote The Talented Mr. Ripley. And she's an amazing suspense fiction writer. She has a book called Plotting and Writing Suspense Fiction. She talks about the essence of a psychological thriller is that we are invited into the mind of essentially the villain, or we are invited into the mind of the criminal. And one of the challenges she encountered often in her career was, how do I make this person relatable, likable? How do I make them a protagonist in any way? And the fact that Hannibal Lecter has so invaded our consciousness, I think, is due to some of the principles she talks about in that book, which is about this embodiment of contrasts, which obviously make a great character anyway, but I think Hannibal Lecter is a really good example of where she's like, okay, and actually Patricia Highsmith says in her book, long before Silence of the Lambs or anything like that, she's like, give him an interest in art, give him an interest in classical music, like get these some redeemable characteristics that we can see, intelligence, compassion for certain amounts of people, or certain kinds of people or animals or children or whatever. Like, and so the fact that Hannibal Lecter has a very clear moral code. So, and he is purposefully set up against people who are in some ways worse than he is. Like Chilton is way worse than he is to some extent. We hate Chilton. And then Miggs in the first scene, of course, is a critical juxtaposition there to set Hannibal Lecter off as being better or more ethical than some of these other characters.
He has a code, at least. Yeah.
Exactly. He has his own moral code. And so I think what makes this such a compelling psychological thriller is the fact that Hannibal Lecter is imbued with so many of these positive qualities that make us like him and want to trust him. And same thing with Clarice. And then the other thing I really want to quickly just reiterate is the power of giving your hero so many disadvantages from the very beginning of the story. She is a woman in a man's field. She's not even just a woman in a man's field. She's a student and a trainee in a man's field. And she has essentially no tools whatsoever other than herself to overcome this totally insurmountable challenge. And it is not easy for her. Every tiny step of it is hard for her, which you talk about in the video. Every single piece of information that she reveals is painful and challenging. And so every single little choice that she makes demonstrates her fortitude and her perseverance and her determination to fulfill this thing. It makes her, all of the disadvantages stacked against her, make this story what it is. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. If she had even one advantage, the scene where she's lying under the garage door at the storage unit.
So nerve-wracking.
It's so stressful. She's about to go under there and she's realizing the position she's putting herself in. But she at the same time doesn't want to worry the guy that is with her, like the storage unit owner or whatever.
Right. I love the way she plays that. I love it.
It's amazing. She's like, look, if this door should fall down, or anything else. It's just such a, and actually the ha is in the script.
Yeah.
That little chuckle in the middle of that line is in the script.
Nice.
I mean, it's so brilliant, Ted Talley, but just that sense of she realizes fully how unequipped and disadvantaged she is. She could die in there, and the only thing she has is a business card to give this guy. She has absolutely no weapons really against the level of evil that she is facing, and that makes this story so powerful.
Yeah. So for me, I kept, in rewatching all of the scenes over and over again, something Hannibal says in the fourth scene between them when Clarice is like, help me catch this person. Like, how do I find it? And he's like, everything you need is in here. And he has a line where he says, simplicity, read Marcus Aurelius, of each particular thing, ask, what is it in and of itself? What is its nature, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like that resonated with me because I think that's something that I have kind of, it's like a mentality that I've developed for myself when working on these videos and trying to explain things or doing second passes of my writing and trying to figure out what's working and what isn't, is like I kind of stop and rather than view each thing in context, really try to, if I'm looking at a script that I've written, translate each thing into its most basic element. Like, what is the pure information that this sentence is communicating? And I kind of just do that line by line. And that helps kind of give me a better sense of what is working and what isn't working. And I think part of it is I know some computer programming. And so part of it is like, I tend to think of things in computer robot terms sometimes, and that helps me. Because like if you're programming, like computers are really, really dumb. And so if you're going to tell a computer how to do anything, you have to literally tell it every step it possible, like turn left and then move forward 2 feet. And then if you're moving a robot, you have to tell it every single thing. And so you have to be able to boil down concepts into their just most basic, like what is actually happening here.
Yeah.
And so just hearing him say that, I was like, oh, Hannibal. Yeah. Like I resonate with that. Like, that's good advice.
So your lesson is actually from Hannibal.
Yeah. Listen to Hannibal when he says simplicity. So I think that can help you kind of find problems in your writing or realize what's actually on the page behind all of the, the window dressing that you've put up around it.
Well, that's one thing that, when we've gone back and forth with our writing, Michael, and you've kind of helped me do a breakdown of a script that I'm working on that is really helpful. I mean, I kind of resist thinking in robot terms sometimes because I'm romantic and like, no, it's not art if it's robotic.
Yeah.
But it is so helpful to have that X-ray vision of like, this scene doesn't feel right. Why doesn't it feel right? And when you do decode it into like, here's what this is actually doing beat by beat, then you can see, oh, it's like the same beat 3 times. And that's why it feels long and boring. We only need one. We just need one of these, and then we get it and move on.
Yeah.
So the robot thing, I get it. I appreciate it, and I think it is very helpful when you don't know why something's not working to turn it into those simple building blocks. You see why you're missing a block. You have too many of this block. It makes it very clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm very glad that robots aren't that smart yet.
Yeah.
They're on their way.
Well, we'll see what happens. All right, cool. Really quick, what's everyone watching this week? Trisha?
Yeah, so last night I watched this amazing and very excellent documentary called Shirkers on Netflix.
Oh, I've heard about this.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. So it's by this filmmaker. Her name is Sandy Tan. And the movie is her looking back at a film that she made, like a narrative film that she made when she was a teenager in 1992 in Singapore. So she and her friends, teenagers, they were in film school. They were in a film class with this like American film professor. And they ended up all making a movie together under the direction of this film professor. And then I don't want to give away too much of what happened, but basically the film was stolen from them and vanished for 25 years. And so the documentary is about the making of the movie, what happened, sort of the mystery of like, who would steal a movie? Who would steal a movie from student filmmakers? It's so insane. And it's this incredibly beautiful sort of memoir from her that at the same time is so tragic and poignant. And she's looking at it with all the benefit of hindsight the way that we do. And just as someone who, as a teenager, was shooting films with my friends, and it really captures the spirit of what is it that drives us as young people, or like pulls us into the movie business, and then those experiences that we all have that end up tragic and horrifying, and it's not what we wanted at all, and it breaks up our
us.
friendships. Yeah.
And then we're no longer enthusiastic and happy and energetic.
Oh my gosh. It's also just an incredibly well-made documentary. It's called Shirkers. It's on your Netflix. Check it out.
Awesome. Alex?
So I've been watching Barry finally on HBO.
Okay.
I'm late to the party, I know, on that one. I love it. People have been recommending it to me for a while. Have you guys seen Barry? Oh, y'all should watch it. It's great because it's as an Angelino, it's fun. It takes place in LA.
Right.
It's about actors who are struggling, and it's like it hurts so much, but it's so true and it's so good.
I think I did see one episode, and it was painful to watch.
It's too real. Yeah. It's if you're in the business and you're especially an actor or no actors who are trying to make it in LA, it's painfully real. But the humor is so dark and funny and spot on. And I feel like it nails some very specific tone that is very hard to nail. Like it's got a lot of heart, but it's also just like brutally violent suddenly. And then it's also very just honest. It does a lot, and it does it all well. And so I'm just incredibly impressed with Barry.
Cool.
Check it out.
Awesome. Yeah. Cool. Brian?
Quick side note before we get into it, because you were talking, Tricia, about the Hannibal Lecter, just sort of the mythos of the character.
Mm-hmm.
It occurred to me that I had seen everything Hannibal Lecter, the character, had been in except for Hannibal Rising. So I watched Hannibal Rising, which my recommendation to all of you is don't watch Hannibal Rising.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah, I had heard the same, but I was like, you know what? It's literally the only thing I hadn't seen. But you got Manhunter in 1986 with Brian Cox as the OG Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah.
Then the movie Hannibal, which is a hot mess, but it's surprising because it's like Steve Zalian and David Mamet wrote it, and Ridley Scott directed it, and there's like good actors, and it's a terrible movie. And then Red Dragon, screenplay by Ted Talley, which Brett Ratner managed to not screw up. And then
amazingly.
And then the television show, which is like complicated and sometimes pretentious, but also like deals with a lot of stuff from the books that you didn't get into otherwise. But
I've heard really good things about the TV show.
It's interesting. Yeah. It's challenging, and there are times where you're like, oh my, I don't need to see like 5 seconds or 30 seconds of wine slowly pouring into a glass with like classical music, and it looks the color of blood, and a lot of that. But it's entertaining, and it does take some of the things out.
Prestige
of the
TV.
Yeah. So anyway, I had to throw that in there. Don't watch Hannibal Rising. Watch other stuff. What you should watch is I went to another Kurosawa matinee at the Vista here in LA, and I saw Ikiru from.
Oh, I love that movie.
Yeah, I was blown away by it. It's hard to tell since it's so fresh in my mind, but it might be like one of my favorite movies of all time.
Wow.
Yeah, it does some really interesting things. It's the first Kurosawa movie I've seen that was took place in a contemporary setting and not feudal Japan kind of thing. Very simply, it's a character who knows he's going to die and tries to sort of regain his life. So we've seen it in American Beauty and Breaking Bad and et cetera, et cetera. But it's just, again, to see a movie that did that long ago and is more complicated and interesting and fascinating. And there's just when you think you sort of get what the main crux of the movie is, it introduces a new idea that makes you think about things. And love the movie Ikiru, Kurosawa. Go check it out.
Really beautiful movie.
Michael.
Nice.
Quid pro quo, Michael.
I watched The Favorite last night, finally, trying to catch up with the Oscar viewing.
Oh, did you love it?
I did.
Yeah,
I loved it.
It's so great.
It's really, really great.
So
I was
great.
struck by it's such a simple, like classic, like conceit of just I love just a couple people. It's a power play, and who's the favorite and who isn't. Like you just get I just love those stories, and you get so invested, and it's such a great juxtaposition of the very simple story with very clear, simple objectives, but like against this complicated, vast, majestic backdrop. And I was I enjoyed it.
Nice.
very,
those
very
those
much.
3 actors.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it's they're
Incredible.
you
too
can't go
good.
wrong.
I feel like Emma Stone is almost like the new like Meryl Streep. Like I feel she's amazing in everything.
That's a
I was
bold
gonna
statement.
say,
I mean,
She's been nominated for 4 Oscars, and she's been in like 11 movies or something.
right. Like I feel like she's never not been amazing. Like not all of her movies are perfect, but that's not her responsibility. Like I think I'm always struck by how amazing she is, and everyone. And it was funny
Like, who
because
doesn't like her? Also,
Right.
I mean,
and as I was watching it, I was like, okay, so Olivia Colman won the Oscar, and like, okay,
Yeah.
okay, that's. I mean, I guess she's good. And then there's this moment that happens kind of in the first 20 minutes or something where there's just this long close up of her where like in that one moment, I went from like, I guess she's pretty good to, oh my God.
Yeah.
Is it
Give
during
this
the
woman
dancing?
yes,
Yeah,
during
yeah,
the
yeah.
dancing scene. It's
So
like,
good.
I love
oh,
the dancing
give
scene.
her all the Oscars right now.
I watch a lot of British TV, so I've been watching Olivia Colman for a decade.
Yeah.
And it's like, I love her. Broadchurch. There's
So
a movie
good.
called Tyrannosaur, which she is unbelievable in.
Yeah.
And so it was like, for me to see her get that recognition, it was like,
Yeah.
made me
She's going to
really
be queen again in The Crown.
happy. Yeah, that's right.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
great.
So excited about
I
it.
feel like those are the best Oscars when it's like someone that like really deserves it and has deserved it for forever.
Yeah.
And
Well,
To be
but
clear-
Glenn Close also is in that category.
Well,
Exactly
okay,
that.
Yeah.
Glenn Close also has deserved
She's
it
been
for-
denied it
Yeah.
many
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Oscars.
But I didn't see The Wife, so I was really happy when Olivia Colman won.
Awesome, cool. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We will see you in the next episode.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
People will say we're in love.
I was like waiting for Brian to do this.
Hey guys, Michael here. First of all, a big thank you from myself and the team to everyone who has subscribed and listened and left all the amazing reviews on iTunes. Make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Screenplay wherever you get your podcasts. It's been really great hearing from you guys on Twitter, so feel free to keep hitting us up there to share any feedback you have. We'd love to hear anything and everything. All of our Twitter handles are in the show notes. And finally, if you want to help us continue to grow both the channel and the podcast, head to the Patreon for Lessons from the Screenplay to become a patron. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.